so much, everybody, for coming. Welcome. Everyone takes their seats. It gets pretty loud in here. There's not any carpeting or anything like that, so if you can just be mindful of that. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming. My name is Hochschartner. I'm the Climate and Clean Energy Director at Maine Conservation Voters. I'm here tonight just to moderate our discussion about two wonderful panelists. We have the agenda up on the side. But I just wanted to start with a little bit about the purpose of the event tonight. So we are here to talk about community partnership planning. We see community partnership planning as various ways in offshore wind and even beyond offshore wind, other kinds of developments where communities can be getting benefits from projects. And tonight we're going to focus very specifically on one specific legal mechanism called the Community Benefits Agreement. So there are other points in the offshore wind process where communities may be getting benefits. If you think things like we're having a lease auction soon for the offshore wind lease areas that developers will bid on. There's opportunities for workforce bidding credits, fisheries bidding credits. Those are areas where money may be coming into the community. That's similar but separate from this specific legal mechanism that we're talking about tonight, the Community Benefits Agreement. And we wanted to come in and just have a purely educational presentation. We are not here as any of the groups sponsoring this event, so Maine Conservation Voters, Maine Climate Action Now, Maine Labor Climate Council, to be party to any eventual or possible community benefits agreement. We're not here to urge anyone to sign a community benefits agreement. We just know that these processes may be starting soon where things could be on the table, and we want to make sure everyone knows what that process will look like so that folks can feel free to engage or not. So that's why we're here tonight. It's also why we're videoing. So this videoing is really going to focus on the presentation to make sure that this can be shared elsewhere in Maine. Because as I was saying earlier, community benefits agreements are really something that can apply to any development. So if a big factory was coming in somewhere else in Maine, that is also a time when a community benefits agreement could be signed. So this is a presentation and information that we may be sharing around the state more broadly, not even specific to offshore wind. So that's what the filming is happening tonight. The other thing that I wanted to just start with is our community agreements. We'd really ask that everyone tonight, they're up on the wall, really focuses on respecting others by listening and making space, hearing what folks have to say, and then 2, focusing on the topic at hand. So tonight, we're not talking about the port siting. I know that often in Searsport, that's what we're talking about. A community benefits agreement could be signed in the instance of a port at either location, Sears Island or Mac Point. It could be signed at neither location. This is really a specific legal mechanism that is just available to communities that may have a large development. And often these kinds of agreements, it's hard to get the community organized in time for developers' timelines, and so the earlier we can get the information out, the better, and that's why we're doing this. So I really thank you all for being here tonight, and also just would love to start with everyone turning to their neighbor on all sides and saying hello. I hope everyone got to introduce themselves. Thank you so much for doing that. We'll let it quiet down. Wonderful. Thank you so much. I know we're all coming with different thoughts and experiences and from different locations, but really excited to be here tonight and truly thank everyone for showing up. And I just want to start by introducing Suzanne
Could you walk through the agenda out loud?
Yes, I can walk through the agenda out loud. Just so folks know, we're going to start with a presentation from Suzanne MacDonald about CBAs more generally. CBAs, that Community Benefits Agreement. You might hear us use that acronym, CBA. Then we're going to go into Q&A with Suzanne, and I'll moderate that. I'm also just going to say up front, we have paper and pens. If we don't have time to get to anyone's question, you can write it down with your email and phone number, and we will get back to you. So we're going to answer every question, but we may not answer them all tonight. Then we're going to have a breakout session so folks can talk to each other about some of these things. And then I'm going to introduce Anxhela, who's going to give a presentation more specifically with a case study about what one community benefits agreement actually looked like in Salem. We'll have a Q&A with Anxhela, just like we did with Suzanne, where we'll go over questions, and you can continue to write things down for us to answer later. And then we'll go into another breakout session, And then we're gonna close up with a framework for how communities think about preparing or not preparing to sign one of these things, how you can start to make some of those decisions. And Amy and I actually baked cookies for that part. So we really do thank you for coming, and we'll have dessert. So anyone who wants to stick around and start thinking about these things and having further conversations will be hanging around. So with that, I will introduce Suzanne MacDonald, who is just fabulous. She knows absolutely everything. She's a senior researcher and project leader at the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, NREL, where she supports stakeholder engagement in community-based energy transition programs, as well as in land-based and offshore wind. Suzanne has nearly 20 years of experience supporting communities to navigate complex change and build climate resilience, most recently as Chief Programs Officer at Maine-based Island Institute. She holds degrees in policy as well as international and urban community development, and she lives here in Maine. Thanks, Lucy. Thanks, Amy, for hosting us, and to the town of Searsport for having us, for all of you for coming out. Let's see, we'll get some slides going here. Hopefully this isn't going to be too boring. There's a lot to cover, so apologies if I go quickly. There's plenty we can go back to and chat. But as Lucy said, my goal here tonight is just to share some research findings from my work at the National Renewable Energy Lab, in the hopes that that information will be helpful for all of you in whatever way you choose to use it. So not getting into the specifics of anything here in Searsport, but just putting some of this topic of community benefits into a broader national and in some ways international context. So why don't we just go ahead to the next slide. So I work at this place called NREL, National Renewable Energy Lab. We're part of what's called the National Lab System that does the work of the US Department of Energy. NREL is the sole national lab that is fully focused on clean energy and helping DOE to understand both the challenges and opportunities related to the US government meeting its clean energy targets. It's a growing institution. We're more than 4,000 people now, a lot of really smart technical people in there, doing a lot of R&D, actual lab work. But one of the interesting things is that one of the biggest areas of growth for NREL right now is in folks who think more about people and communities and the potential trade-offs around clean energy and what it means for folks on the ground. We do a lot of work, like I said, mostly for the federal government, but we have a lot of partnerships with industry, academia, and other partners. We have 4 campuses. We're primarily based in Colorado. We've got smaller offices in DC and Alaska. And we actually have a strong team of about 7 people strong here in Maine working remotely for NREL. My role at NREL, as I said, is focusing more on the people and community side of all of this. My professional experience has mostly been working with small rural communities like Searsport and the islands off the coast of Maine. And so a lot of my work is advising the Department of Energy on how the programs and supports that they try to offer at this level can be more useful, more accessible, and relevant to the needs on the ground. Part of that work, based off of my previous experience, does include some research and engagement related to offshore wind. And that's in part because, as Lucy said, I am based here in Rockland. I've lived in Rockland for almost 16 years, and prior to that lived out, at least seasonally, out on Manhegan Island. And so have been thinking a lot about the ideas for offshore wind in the Gulf of Maine for a very long time. Some of you may know a bit about the history that Governor Baldacci had a task force back in 2009. I participated in that to try to advise on how to engage communities back then, and have done a lot of work, particularly as the test site or the demonstration area off of Manhegan Island was announced, supported those folks to work on a community benefit agreement, and learned from some of the other islands off the coast of New England, Block Island, Martha's Vineyard, Nantucket, that really have been at the forefront of this industry. So my work at NREL is not Maine specific. My work is really nationally focused. But when I was aware that this topic was of growing interest in Maine, I was asked to come and join you here today. We are just about 2 years through a 5-year work plan to explore this topic of community benefits at NREL. My colleague Matilda Kreider, who's credited at the outside of this deck, created most of these slides and is the true expert
but she lives in Denver, and it was a little bit of a trip to get here, so I drove up from Rockland, and will do my best to reference her work. So, yeah, I think we can get going. So, what are community benefits? You'll hear about this a lot tonight. One of the things that we've learned in our research over the last 2 years is that there are many different definitions that people use for this term. It means different things to different people in different contexts, but we have this working definition that we use at NREL just to help scope our work and our research. So it says an agreement, fund, or other mechanism voluntarily used by a developer to provide additional financial or non-financial benefits to a community. So I'll just walk through a couple of these terms that we use. Voluntary is an important one here. I think there are currently very few requirements in the United States for community benefits in wind energy development, and so they're typically provided entirely by the choice of the developer. I should say our research is actually inclusive of land-based wind development, and so actually, interestingly enough, Maine is one of the exceptions to this rule because there are requirements in Maine for community benefits in the land-based wind sector. We are seeing more of this talk about whether it's bidding credits through the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management or BOEM process, or other sort of incentives given through power purchase negotiations, but they're still not mandating or requiring community benefits. They're suggesting or incentivizing them. So that's one thing that has guided our research. The other piece that I just want to explain is they're voluntarily used by a developer. I just want to be clear, particularly in this context, it's not always the developer of the project. So in this case, whoever's putting the turbines in the ocean, but it could be a port developer, whoever's developing the transmission line that comes to shore. It could be a government agency or another stakeholder. A key difference between community benefits and other types of benefits that we might see in energy development is that this is intended to benefit the whole or the majority of a community. So in land-based wind in particular, there's something called landowner payments. Basically, the person who owns or leases their land to a wind developer receives direct payment. In some instances, we talk about something called project labor agreements or PLAs. That's a type of agreement that gives specific benefits to workers on a project. When we talk about community, we're talking about community benefits, something that benefits this broader group or sense of community. Part of that is being focused more at the local level. So we talk a lot about those who are most impacted by a potential type of development. There are some instances where there are state or regional level benefits. One of the things that's really pertinent here in the Gulf of Maine is the concept of a regional fisheries compensation fund. So that's an example of sort of regional benefits, but it is provided to a certain set of stakeholders, being folks in the fisheries. The other last piece I'll just say is additional. There are other benefits that come from energy development or development in general, typically coming from taxation, property and sales tax. That's not what we're talking about when we say community benefits. That's just sort of part of the system and the realities of existing. So that's our definition. We can go to the next slide. We have developed a framework. We've got 5 different forms or structures. So we've done a lot of research in this space and basically categorized the types of benefits into these 5 buckets. So the first is the one that we kind of talked about as starting out here tonight, right? Community benefit agreements, CBAs. It's the really simple way to say this. And I think it's the first term that often comes to mind in these discussions. So they can be between developers and local governments, tribal governments, and other community organizations. I think it's important to note that they can be legally binding. Some cases they're not, and so that's sort of an interesting nuance, but they are more formal agreements. Our research also has tracked direct payments to local governments outside of one of these agreements. They've tracked broader community benefit funds that are established that might have one-time payments or people sort of apply for grants. The entities that oversee those funds can really vary. It could be the developer themselves, it could be the local government, it could be a nonprofit or a community board that oversees that decision making. And then we've got direct investment in local priorities or programs. So instead of going through a fund that has to get administered, there can be sort of donations made to individual initiatives or organizations. And this last piece we talk about is the non-financial benefits that we sometimes capture. This is a really broad bucket. It can be anything like expanding broadband service because of some of the work that's being done with the transmission lines brings internet access. There can be workforce training programs, a lot of other sort of initiatives that are not directly giving funds to an entity. We do separate out mitigation measures that might be required. So for example, sometimes there's requirements around wildlife monitoring. We keep that sort of separate from this bucket. I'll say that these examples can and often do interact with each other. So it could be that a community benefit agreement exists that also includes a community benefit fund as part of the CBA. We are just trying to create some common language through our research, but we realize that it doesn't capture all the nuance and gray area in here. We'll go to the next slide, please. So there's a lot of variation based off of the research that we've done and what we found. So the use of community benefits can really vary from project to project, community to community. And so the first area of variations really can show up around financial benefits. So as described on the previous slides, the funds could be given directly to a local government or placed in a fund that is distributed over time. On the non-financial benefit side, on the right-hand side, this really can come down to the difference between the purpose or the focus, the target of that benefit. And so is the benefit focused at a conservation initiative or an education facility? That's definitely an area where we see a lot of variation. And then across all types of these financial and non-financial benefits, there's variation in the who makes the decisions about the benefits. Is it primarily the developer? Is it a local community or process, a regulatory entity? We also have a lot of differences in the timeline, so when those benefits are decided upon and distributed, and who is actually receiving the benefits as well. I think that it's okay. Generally speaking, we see efforts that sort of are very prescriptive. This is a community benefit and this is the way that it happens. Our research has shown that, there's not necessarily a right or a wrong way to do this. Variation in all of this allows these processes and mechanisms to really be customized to what a community wants and what is important to them. So whether that's a decision-making process where there's really a strong local government, or maybe it's not trying to run it through the government, there's lots of different preferences that can come into play at the local level when we have this degree of variability. Go to the next slide, please. So why are we even talking about this? I think you heard a little bit from Lucy about why there's a conversation happening here, and why is this maybe showing up more nationally, and why a national organization is taking a look at this. So what our research is finding, again, in the wind energy sector, is that community benefit mechanisms are sort of an emerging practice here in the United States. They haven't been standardized, there hasn't been wide use of them for some time. That said, there's a long history of community benefit mechanisms in Europe, of developers providing CBAs and community benefit funds. And then there's been a lot of research that's gone on, social science research and economic research, to really help track what's going on in this space. Land-based wind has been around for several decades. In Europe, it's more than 20 years they've had offshore wind turbines in the ocean, and they've been using these mechanisms. So it's a place for us to turn and look and see what can we learn from there. As offshore wind in the industry sort of takes off here in the United States, we're hearing a lot more about the role of community benefits. There's different ways in which community benefits are being used to meet certain criteria and goals. Some of that is the focus on equity and justice and trying to be mindful of where benefits flow in this next round of energy development for this nation. We do feel like sometimes these community benefits can support more equitable outcomes, and in some cases they can actually challenge them or reinforce inequities, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later. And we're definitely seeing that, in other technologies that are trying to understand this as well. So I have colleagues who in the utility scale solar world are trying to figure out this mechanism. So it's not just offshore wind. But there's definitely growing interest from folks at the community level, at the federal government, state level, and within tribal governments and certainly the offshore wind industry to better understand what this mechanism looks like. Next slide, please. I've got some slides here on land-based wind. I'm not going to spend a lot of time, but as I mentioned at the outset, Maine is really one of the leaders in the nation in requiring community benefits. This started with the Wind Energy Act that was established back in 2003. There's been many amendments to that over the years, but for quite some time there's been an expectation that land-based wind in Maine should be undertaken in a manner that ensures significant tangible benefits to the people of the state, including but not limited to residents of communities that host wind energy facilities. Next slide. There's basically some requirements for land-based wind, where a community benefits package needs to be in existence at no less than $4,000 per turbine, average out over per year per turbine over a 20-year period. There are some exceptions to that, and there are ways that host communities of wind projects can ask for state assistance in navigating this opportunity, but this is something that's been in place for quite some time in other parts of the state. Next slide. One of the things that was helpful to us nerdy researchers is that they put out some very clear definitions of tangible benefits, community benefit packages. Expedited permitting is part of this, was this thing that was being discussed quite a bit a couple of administrations ago. So it's just helpful for us to see that Maine is already asking this and using this language. Next slide, please. As offshore wind became something that folks were interested in pursuing here in the state, they did amend the Maine Wind Energy Act to require benefits as part of the Public Utilities Commission process, as part of the solicitation there. So that's sort of a new requirement that has come into place for state level projects. And as we heard earlier this week with the upcoming auction, BOEM, the federal agency overseeing this process, is going to suggest bidding credits or offer bidding credits for other types of benefits around workforce development and fisheries compensation. Okay, next slide, please. I'll try to go through this really quickly as well. This is just kind of pulling some of our research from land-based. We've looked at over 1,000 projects across the country that have offered community benefits. And the reason why land-based is interesting to us is we only have a couple of offshore examples to go on. What we found is that contributions to local organizations and causes are actually the most common mechanism that's provided in land-based development. As it turns out, fire departments come up big on this list. Community benefit agreements are actually less common, except for in places like New York and Maine, because we talked about this. The newer the project is in the land-based space, the more likely it is to have one. As we talked about, there's a growing interest in all of this. It is challenging to get information as this sector's been up and running for several years, several decades, predating the internet. It's hard to find the details sometimes. Okay, next. These are just examples of Maine project benefits in case it's interesting to see some examples, but we'll keep moving. A couple more here in Maine, including one that's under construction. So just high levels of what we have found on the offshore wind side nationally is we've organized the types of benefits that are being discussed or have already been finalized on these different buckets. So agreements that are, or benefits that are specific to and proximate to projects, cable landings, which is where the cables come ashore, and ports. So I've got a slide on each of these. We'll just go through quickly. We can go, okay. So we've got 6 examples of what we call project CBAs. Again, this is our term. One of the things that you can see here is that in many instances, up until the last year or so, these project-specific benefit agreements were really offered to island communities. So communities that were very proximate to the development, or more so in many cases than a land-based community. There's a lot of variation in what is offered here. We have examples of expanding grid infrastructure, expanding access to internet in the community, ratepayer relief for low-income residents are some of the examples that we've seen in this space. Next slide. We have a very interesting set of information to take a look at when it comes to the cable landings. So there's been 5 examples that agreements that have been finalized, and several more that are in progress. And this is where really large amounts of money are being discussed. So anything from $16 to $170 million Some of which are structured as annual payments to governments over time. Some are earmarked for certain municipal purposes. And some of them have also included non-financial benefits, which is sort of the community being able to influence some of the development process. So like, in what season will they build the cable landing, so they can help influence and ensure beach access. The key takeaway here, again, is that there's very significant financial benefits being offered in this space, much more so than any type of energy infrastructure that we track. Importantly for the conversation here, we've seen less examples when it comes to port communities. We do have some, and Anxhela will talk about an exciting one shortly. And I think part of that is because there's in some ways a perception that port development is already bringing benefits. It's bringing jobs and economic opportunity. However, in these instances, there were decisions that they wanted to enhance those benefits. Oftentimes, you can see in the list of examples there, there's an interest in trying to help the local community benefit from this new economic activity by offering workforce development, job training, so folks maybe have the chance to work directly at the port facility or in connected industries. Okay, next slide. I did just want to mention that we think of tribal nations as separate than local communities. There's increasingly a number of examples of offshore wind tribal benefit agreements here on the East Coast as well as in California. They have also prioritized important investments that they've been interested in, and so we're starting to track that as well. Okay? This is just to show that one developer can enter into multiple different types of agreements. It doesn't have to be sort of like one agreement with one entity and that's it, and sort of a zero-sum game. We've got examples with Vineyard Wind, how they've supported local organizations on the vineyard, on the mainland, and with the tribe and the Nantucket being close by as well. Next slide. I wanted to get into some detail around what has happened on Monhegan. There's a lot of interesting information available online that details this process, and I can answer some more questions on this, but I think it's really important to understand what the precedent is here in Maine for a community, a very small community, smaller than Searsport, coming together to try to understand the pros and the cons of what this project could mean for them. They ran a very extensive process. They were able to get the financial support from the developer to actually bring a lawyer, a legal team on board to help them with this negotiation. And at the end of the day, they were able to pursue a couple of different options. They took a community vote and ended up with a unanimous vote in favor of one of those two community benefit options. The Monhegan story to me is the pivot from sort of being reactive to saying a developer saying, here's what I will give you, to the community saying, here's the future we see for our community and how you might fit into it. And so for a tiny community of 70 people, I think it's a pretty impressive one to consider, and I'd be happy to talk in greater detail about what they did there if you're interested to hear about it. I'm just gonna try to wrap, I know I'm going over time. I would just say part of our research through all of this engagement, we've been, interviews and research that we've been doing, we've been trying to track what do communities really think about this? I think what we've seen is there's just a lot of variation. The devil's in the details. Communities and entities can see all of this in different ways, but that it does seem that the decision-making processes, how all of this happens is a really big piece. It's not just the outcome, like how many dollars or how many jobs or what fund, it's how it happens. That is a really big deciding factor here, and trust is a big piece of that. Next slide. We're definitely tracking sort of the ways that they vary across these sectors. I won't get into this too much, but just tracking some trends. How are we seeing it different in offshore versus land-based? What we're seeing in offshore is a lot more engagement, a lot more of this. Land-based, a developer might go to the town, we'll give you this money, town manager says, cool, it's done. Maybe it's in the paper. What we're seeing in the offshore wind space is a lot more organizing, a lot more community discussion around what communities are looking to have, clarity and transparency around process, and when funds are available, hiring professional facilitators, legal advice. This definitely comes down to this equity thing. Who has the money and the time and the expertise to do this? In some ways, we see communities that do that perhaps lead to bigger outcomes in terms of dollars. Next slide. How do they relate to project outcomes? Do projects with community benefits, are they more likely to get built? Are they more likely to be met with local acceptance, higher levels of local acceptance? I'll just be really short and just say that, it's inconclusive at this point. We have examples, obviously, where projects have gotten built with benefit agreements, many of them, but we also have examples where benefits were offered and projects still, for various reasons, did not go forward. Next slide. One of the things we're really looking at is this understanding of how do benefits connect to impact. Sometimes we're taught, the traditional assumption is that compensation is given in response to an unavoidable and negative impact. But what we're seeing is that in some of the bigger dollar amounts, $200+ million, are going to communities that have cable landings that no one sees, and it has minimal disruption in terms of at least the construction process. So that's something we're interested in, what is driving these dollar amounts and what's leading to those decisions. How do they relate to equity? This is this piece, if you have access to resources, you might be able to get a better quote unquote deal than if you don't. And so I won't spend too much time there. Key takeaways, last slide. Essentially, the key takeaways here are that we don't have a standard or typical definition for how this works in the United States just yet. There's complicated, meaning unclear, relationships with key outcomes in terms of does it lead to equity, more equitable outcomes or more successful projects. Even with all of that said, with the lack of clarity and uncertainty and variability, it's a huge growing area of interest across sectors, as I said, whether it's researchers, the government, industry, communities. There's a lot of folks trying to figure out this topic, and I'm just happy to be able to try to talk to you about it tonight. There's a few more slides that we're happy to share that have resources that you might want to check out. We have a website called Wind Exchange that is, in the next week or so, we'll have a searchable database of all the agreements that we've tracked in both offshore and land-based in the US. We have a number of publications that are specific to the Gulf of Maine, as well as port community development from the West Coast in particular. So if you're interested to learn more about our research on that topic, I'm happy to share.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you so much, Suzanne. Suzanne knows so much, it's just incredible. Well, I'd love to open it up for Q&A, and the way that this will work is I'll call on folks, and then just to make sure that everyone can hear the question, I'll repeat your question, but do speak up so I can hear you. So does anyone have any questions for Suzanne? And Suzanne, you can just stay there with your microphone.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. I'm Paul. I live in town here in Surfport. We keep talking about developer, and agreement, CBA requires two consenting parties. We certainly have a public interest party in Surfport that's generated a great amount of interest, but we don't have a developer. We can talk till the cows come home about an agreement, but we don't have an agreement with anyone. And the likelihood of a developer being a party to this, arguably, may be very slim. The grant applications don't look good at this point. We're looking at $1 billion in expense that we're going to try and cover with perhaps $300 million in grant money. And forget the legal challenge about bone, DOT funds and intermodal transportation and all that. We're going to try and cover $1 billion project with perhaps a $300 million grant, which requires bonding on the part of the state. So we potentially enter into this agreement with what parties? If we have the state invested via bond.
Is that the question there, Paul? Who would the agreement be with?
What does an agreement look like?
Who does
an
it?
investing developer becomes the state.
What does an agreement look like when the investing developer is the state? And I would just jump in for a quick thing before Suzanne, and then I'll pass it over to Suzanne. And that is that on the one hand, some of the investment will come in the state, from the state. There will likely also be a developer company, and that will happen, that we know who that is after the request for proposals. The reason this kind of presentation is happening earlier, some communities even do this sort of like local organizing work before there's even a project on the table, just to get themselves ready for an eventual project. And so we're really just trying to get in here early, knowing that we don't know who the developer is yet, but we might want to start organizing, or people might want to start organizing, or not, but just to get that information. But I'll pass it to Suzanne.
Yeah, I mean, I think the only other thing I would add is that in some of the other states where wind parks are being developed, the state government themselves are taking a role and really making, being sort of the impetus for that. But I think as Lucy said, they typically will identify through some sort of process a developer, someone who will actually develop the port itself. So I think the idea here is that at New Jersey is an example, they've got a wind port project where the state really got involved to develop this project, but a developer is ultimately the one that's selected to go and develop the site. So I think the idea here is that it would be that developer that is selected to develop the port facility itself.
Any other questions?
We have a host of places where the developer left. Long Beach, California, Humboldt, California, New Jersey. And right now the trend in the industry, if you're talking about the developer or being Nordic or any of the large players in this thing, Crowley Corporation, they're walking away from these things left and right. And we can make all sorts of agreements that benefit the community with the developer. But what happens if this venture fails and we've invested to the point that we've given away our greatest asset, our waterfront, and if you're Sears Island or Mac Point, albeit it could be Mac Point, what do we have if we have an agreement with a party that no longer exists and this thing is in ultimate favor?
Yeah, I mean, what I'm hearing in your question is a topic we're hearing a lot about, which is sort of the accountability mechanisms where agreements may be entered into, but who actually tracks that they're actually delivered on. So, for example, there's a lot of focus around jobs development in Vineyard Wind, and they have researchers that are actually collecting, a third party that's collecting and reporting out on this to the state. So it's not the developer themselves doing it. And so, anyways, as a lot of these ideas of agreements or funds sort of get formalized, the next step that everybody's saying is how do we know if they actually happen. So I think that increasingly the agreements, the discussions include some sort of reference and expectation. If the ownership of a facility transfers, what's the criteria by which, how is the commitment going to continue and transfer with that? We see that a lot in the land-based side. Companies are merging and selling assets off to each other all the time, and that's one of the things we've tracked is sort of how do those benefit agreements or the sort of the agreements travel there. The other thing I would just mention really quickly is I think there's a conversation to be had about the timing of when the benefits are provided. I think typically what we've seen in the research is that benefits may be announced or sort of fully committed to once a project becomes operational. And however, the folks on Monhegan, I think, kind of took a tip from folks from Block Island, and they said it can take years and years for these things to get developed. At the same time, the communities, quote unquote, coming to the table and trying to follow along and, in those instances, be a good partner in some respects to work with the developer to figure all of this out. They negotiated successfully to receive some of the benefits at an earlier stage. So there was an agreement that if the project sort of term sheet, which is part of the PUC process, was approved, then the community would receive $100,000 to invest in their broadband infrastructure efforts. So it didn't pay for the whole project, but they used it as match for a federal grant. That was really helpful for them, and it was basically a way for the developer to say, that project still hasn't been built off of Monhegan, but they have derived benefits. And so I think that's another thing to think about, is the timing of when the benefits are provided is something that you could suggest and talk about.
Thanks so much for that, Suzanne.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was wondering, it sounds, and I know you had to go really quickly through
Yeah,
that.
sorry.
No, it's okay. Time is time.
Yeah.
It sounds like a lot of the benefits are offsetting, potential issues.
Yeah.
Like we're gonna help volunteer firefighters because they might need to
Yeah.
kind of development. Are you guys looking at that, like the offset, and how often is there actually, you know, a tangible overage of a benefit as opposed to just offsetting potential issues? Is it just all
It's such an interesting question. We're so interested in it. Part of it is like your question is like perception of impact, right? Like there's very concrete things, like if you're doing construction on the road and you have detours, or if, you know, yes, there is sort of additional EMT and, you know, firefighting support that typically comes during construction phase of things like that. That stuff's pretty clear. But there's other sort of harder to quantify things that might be really meaningful to a local community, but to some nerdy researcher, they wouldn't necessarily perceive that as like a direct impact, right? And so I think that's one of the things. I think the other thing is that it just comes down to how these negotiations play out. The example on Monhegan, it was that they, so Monhegan pays 70 cents a kilowatt hour, actually more than that now, but at the time, which is probably in the top 20 highest electric rate in the country. And the folks that were interested in developing offshore wind knew that. And so it wasn't a crazy thing in my mind that they went to the community and they said, we'll give you some power for free from this project. And here you go, here's your benefit. And I think the community surprised a lot of people by saying, actually, we don't want that. They had questions about the power production and who would own it after 20 years. And so they actually ran a really amazing process, I think, that I tell people all over the country, because I do a lot of calls virtually with communities just like this. And what they did is that they actually took a step back and they said, how does this show up in our future? So they did a community facilitated process where they tracked what are our assets, what's important to us on Monhegan, what might we want somebody to invest in a positive sense, and then what are our challenges that we see down the road, and how might this project somehow address some of those things. And so they kind of pivoted from this sort of reactive, like we'll take what you offer, to a proactive to say, this is what's meaningful to us, how do you fit in? And so I think that process to me, I think for a small community that I think there was a real power dynamic at play, you know, these big, huge companies come in, they're not from this state, they might not be from this country. How does your little community show up in this space? I think it was very empowering for them to kind of say, here's what's important to us. And then the ultimate agreement actually responded to that. So their agreement you can find online is investing in their local priorities, which was the broadband internet, their on-island energy system, scholarships for their kids, and so things that were meaningful to them. So I think that's kind of like the potential. I'm not here to tell anybody what to do. I just want to share these experiences. But I think a next step that often happens from these types of conversations is for communities to say, how would we want to go about doing this, right? Sometimes it's the comp plan. You know, you have a comprehensive plan that outlines your goals, and just sharing that is a great starting point. So that was kind of a long, rambling answer. I don't think it always directly connects. I think it sometimes does, and sometimes is surprising, and you don't, you know, you see school playgrounds, you see hospitals, things that are not direct but important, and I think that's the opportunity here for a community.
Thank you so much, Suzanne. And I think that leads us well into our first breakout. So what I do want to say is if you had more questions for Suzanne, please write them down. Write your email if you'd prefer that we call you. I don't think Suzanne will be able to call you, but I can talk to Suzanne and call folks. So whatever the best way to reach you is, write down your question, a way for us to get in touch with you, and we will do that research or connect with experts and get back to you. But to start, we did just want to have some time to discuss as small groups, what does your community need to thrive? Knowing that this is not the space that we're going to reach any answers, that Searsport may never want to sign a community benefits agreement, but these are the questions that probably would be some of the first to think about. So I'd love if folks could break out into like 4 different groups. So maybe the first 3 rows here are one group, the back. But otherwise, we're going to get to the second half of the presentation. This obviously was not enough time or all the people that you need to talk about what your community needs to thrive, but just a good opportunity to start thinking in that framework and think about whether this is a conversation that you would want to continue and what venue you might want to continue it in. So thank you all for participating in that. I really appreciate it. And I'm going to just take the next couple seconds to introduce Anxhela Mile, who is also fantastic, also knows an incredible amount about community benefits. She is a staff attorney at Conservation Law Foundation in the Clean Energy and Climate Change and Environmental Justice programs. In her role, she focuses on reducing carbon emissions in a just manner and ensuring Massachusetts reaches its climate targets by working alongside community groups to improve energy efficiency, permitting and siting of renewable energy facilities, and eliminating polluting plants. Prior to joining CLF, Anxhela was an associate at a boutique law firm in White Plains, New York. She also served as an assistant editor and co-author on a publication on the Sustainable Development Goals and Indigenous Peoples' Rights. And we brought Anxhela here today because Anxhela has a lot of experience on a very specific project. So we heard from Suzanne about what is happening all over the country, the kind of research that's getting done, the various opportunities there might be for community benefits. And Anxhela is really here to give us a case study of what could this look like, or what did this look like in one place. So with that, I'll give it to her.
Good evening. Can everyone hear me? Okay, great. Well, thank you so much for having me here in Searsport. I am based out of Boston, Massachusetts, so I'm delighted to be up in this part of Maine. I've seen quite a bit of your beautiful state, and I'm always looking forward to finding new communities to speak to and new places to see in the area. And faces to meet in person. So I think these in-person gatherings are really important and crucial, especially as the world is becoming more remote. So I appreciate you all taking time out of your evening to join us today. So my name is Anxhela Mile, and I'm a staff attorney at CLF, and I'm here to speak to you about an experience that I had working with a community group in Salem, Massachusetts. This is just what worked for the community there, and they really are pleased with the outcome, and there are some lessons learned in ways that it could have been improved, but that's why we're doing this outreach now, so that other communities can gain from what went well in Salem and what could have even gone better. And you can take this information with you and tailor it to your specific community needs. I don't have or you know what, let's see. Awesome. Maybe up there. All right. Maybe you can do it, Amy? Let's see. All right, awesome. So just to give some context, I'm a lawyer, so just a little bit of a brief background, some definitional terms here. So the community at hand is Salem, Massachusetts, which in Massachusetts is designated an environmental justice population. Environmental justice was codified, so it was legally defined in Massachusetts in 2021 with the Roadmap Law, and the Roadmap Law set greenhouse gas emissions for the Commonwealth. It amended a prior law called the Global Warming Solutions Act, and with this, it also defined the criteria for environmental justice populations, which is based on income, race, and limited English proficiency. And Salem, Massachusetts meets all four criteria. So, just some things to consider when we're speaking about specific community needs and what, ways in which the developer was attuned to what the community was seeking there. Beyond kind of the legal definition, what's unique about Massachusetts is environmental justice, let's say outreach. Beyond, I would say, just those communities, it really wants agencies to engage with the community in a meaningful way. So there is certain criteria. So whether it's translation services or public notice or outreach, they want to make sure that people are aware of what is happening in their communities. And there are certain criteria that we look at to see if meaningful engagement occurred. Okay, next slide, please. So to turn it to Salem, Salem is hosting the state's second major offshore wind port. This is a mix of a private-public partnership between the city of Salem and Crowley Wind Services. So I know Crowley got mentioned before. This is an agreement with Crowley, so one of the bigger, I would say, offshore wind developers. The terminal is going to be an operations center for turbine pre-assembly, transportation, staging activities, and storage of assembly components. So it's not, so essentially, any, let's say if turbines need to be, fixed in a certain spot or then sent off-site, this is where they're going to be stored. So it'll be a port. And what's unique is that the port there it's very deep, so it's really kind of seen as the perfect place to host this development. What's also unique in Salem is that the port here is actually resulting in redevelopment of an old coal fire plant that was shut down prior to this, so they're actually also going to be engaging in remediation and cleanup of that site and ensuring that certain jobs are kept in the area. Construction is beginning this year and should finalize by 2026, and the site is expected to support 6.1 gigawatts of capacity, which is 61% of our Commonwealth's goal by 2035, so pretty significant in terms of how much energy it's going to be producing and supporting, really. Okay, next slide. So who are the stakeholders here? Who did we work with? What are their names? So the group that I'll be mentioning, the acronym is called SAFE. They're Salem Alliance for the Environment. They approached us last spring to assist with the Community Benefits Agreement. They're a local environmental organization, so they're based in Salem. They know their community very well, that wants to recognize Salem's unique history as a coastal city with a diverse population, but is also supportive of the energy transition. And SAFE brought together various groups and formed a greater coalition, so not just their own organization. They formed the Salem Offshore Wind Alliance, SOA, which was made up of the League of Women Voters, Point Neighborhood Association, the Historic Derby Association, and other surrounding neighborhood groups. So these were kind of the folks that were a part of the greater coalition, and they came together because they knew that Crowley and the mayor in Salem had actually signed a memorandum of understanding, so an agreement to negotiate a CBA, but that memorandum of understanding, so that agreement to agree, let's say, made no mention of including the community, which to them could be deemed as exclusionary. Why is the community not part of this process? How do we get involved? So they started to raise the alarm bells because there was a prior CBA with prior development that they also weren't fully involved with. So they really wanted to make sure that things were done correctly this time around and that they were included in the process. And so as I say below, they worked with us. I'm going to talk about this specific process. I know Suzanne talked about community benefits. I will try to talk about it quickly just from my angle and experience because I think you all got a really good overview, and then I want to get into the specifics of how this worked in Salem, Massachusetts. But to take a step back, what are community benefits? As you've heard, community benefits can take the shape and form of many things. It can result in education services, investing in infrastructure, remediating pollution, improving, trying to add more green space, thereby, improving local air quality and health, even training, education support, money for a police and fire department. There's a lot of different variety of what community benefits could be. And also community benefits agreements, what I'll be talking about in Salem, is only one form. So you could also have a good neighbor agreement, a project labor agreement, that's on the bottom left, a community benefit plan, or and other forms. So, but the one that I'll be focusing on is the CBA. So next slide, please. And so CBAs, I think when negotiated correctly and done right, are legal agreements, so are contracts. So the concept first began in the 1990s. One of the major CBAs developed didn't have anything to do with energy development. It had to do with the Staples Center out in LA. And this is where the concept, at least in the US, really took form. And the goal is to promote development, and there's actually an incentive from the developer side to engage in a CBA because they don't want to result in, let's say, years of litigation, years of community opposition, just opposition to them coming to a community. So developers actually are pretty incentivized to come in and to see what they can offer to ensure that the community is happy with the project and to not oppose it per se. So I think, that's an important caveat, but a question got posed before about benefits and burdens of projects, and I think that's a great question, because I think communities need to be honest with themselves about, what do we see as gaining from this development, what can we maximize on, and what do we want the developer to limit in terms of damage done in one area and, harm in another. So, I think I mentioned everything there. And then I will just say a little brief background on kind of the federal development. So we had, great expertise on what, is happening throughout the country. What is unique right now, and at least in Massachusetts, there aren't any state requirements for community benefits agreement, at least for the energy space. There's some guidance for hospitals, let's say, but federally right now with the IRA, so the Inflation Reduction Act, and the BIL, or the IIJA, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, depending on which acronym you want to use, applicants actually, if they're applying for certain federal money, do have certain stipulations that they have to engage in community benefits. So there is an incentive actually for some of these really big wind companies or just energy developers in general, that if they're going to receive, let's say, a tax grant or a reduction on some of their project costs, they have to engage in some sort of community benefits. Now, this doesn't have to be a CBA. This could also be a project labor agreement. So who are they hiring from the community? How diverse is that group? But it is important to consider that there are certain mechanisms that are coming in place to kind of add a little bit more teeth, and again, to further incentivize these developers to come out to these communities. So, all right, next slide. And now let's get to what occurred between SAFE. So, as I mentioned before, in this particular instance, SAFE was in a unique position because the mayor and the developer had agreed to negotiate a CBA. So they were concerned about that, but also happy, let's say, because they were supportive of the development that was coming in the community. They saw it as a positive that this area was going to be remediated. So they really wanted to make sure that they were at the heart of the negotiations. So they created this greater coalition, SOA, as I mentioned before, that was consisted of a variety of neighborhood associations and other groups. And then they reached out to Conservation Law Foundation to see what we can do. In the beginning of our involvement, we really just served as a member of the coalition. We wanted to know, what did the group want? We weren't coming into them saying, here's what we think is best for Salem. We were just hearing what do residents in Salem want for their community. And we engaged in outreach with the mayor's office. So we wrote a couple of letters to the Salem Legal Solicitor's Office and spoke to the mayor directly to say, hey, look, at the end of the day, if this CBA goes in place, you're going to have a really large CBA for the second offshore wind port in Massachusetts. It's in your best interest to make sure that the community is at the center of these negotiations, because you don't want, as was stated before, you don't want the process to go poorly. The process needs to occur correctly as well. And we kind of used it as leverage, essentially, to see if the mayor was going to get us within the negotiations. And after some back and forth, it ultimately did work successfully. So we ended up legally representing SAFE and SOA. That was Conservation Law Foundation, and we also worked with a legal expert based out of Albany Law School who has done a lot of extensive research on enforcing CBAs. And then we signed a memorandum of understanding with the mayor to say, we're going to be a part of these negotiations. We're going to hear the terms that you're going to be providing to Crowley. We're going to see the terms back. But there was a stipulation that at the end of the day, the CBA was still signed with the mayor's office and with Crowley. But that did work. So the timeline process was, the mayor's office and the developer made the agreement to agree. SAFE engaged in early coalition building. We had conversations with the mayor's office. We had the MOU. It resulted in them including SAFE at the table, and then negotiations began. Now, I will have to say, once negotiations with Crowley began, it was very quick, and I think I'm very grateful to SAFE and SOA's work pre-negotiations, which is why timing is could happen now, even though, let's say, we don't know what the outcome is going to be here in Maine, because they knew exactly what they wanted from the developer. They knew, here's money that we want to go to the schools, here's money that we want for the fire department, here's money that we want, in terms of port cleanup, port electrification, added green space. And that really helped move things along, because there were times in the negotiations where, let's say someone saw something that was lower on one sheet that decreased money in one area and wanted to ensure that that money wouldn't get cut. So I think knowing what you're going to ask from the developer is really important. And because SAFE was really attuned to their community, they had that down, which was great. And then negotiations were very quick. It happened within a few weeks. And then the contract was finalized and wrapped up early this year. And then next slide, please. Yep, so these are just some of the things that were in the CBA, but I'll speak towards it generally. But in the end, Crowley committed to fund $9 million in direct funding to the community, which was 3% of total project costs, which I believe was the most that they've contributed to a community thus far. So some of the things in the CBA, which is public, which is also fantastic, because a lot of these CBAs, I don't know if it was mentioned before, but sometimes are behind, they're closed off. You maybe can only see the first page. To make a CBA public is not always easy to get access to. So the CBA in Salem, Massachusetts is public. You can all read it. But they did commit to hire from the local community. They agreed to port electrification. A lot of money went to funding public schools for education services, money for the harbor master, money for the police department, the fire department, money for sustainability measures, and language services, just to name a few. I mean, it's a pretty extensive contract, and we can go through each of the provisions and then tally it all up. But in general, I think both parties here were pretty happy with the outcome. And then next slide, please. Yeah, so here's an update. So as of August 15th, construction began, so a little over a month ago now. Construction is beginning here in the port. So we see here, actually in this photo, you do have members from both, let's say, Massachusetts state government. You also have direct members from SAFE, which were represented there, which I love to see that they're there with leading figures in the area. And the other thing is that the community is active in the implementation process, which I think is very important to make sure that things go well, because the first step, let's say, or one of the major initial steps is drafting the CBA and executing it, but how it gets implemented is really what's important. It's not a matter of just what's on the paper, but how the developer is actually going to follow through with what they've promised and committed to the neighborhood. So here, part of the oversight committee are direct members of SAFE and SOA, and I'm very pleased to see that. Meetings have been ongoing. We're having conversations with the mayor's office to say, hey, this meeting went really well, but here's what the developer could do better. So it's an ongoing process. There's always going to be lessons learned, and there's always going to be things that are going to be tweaked throughout it, because every contract is different and every developer is going to handle a community differently. So that's the major update. And then just to, I guess, wrap up some of the lessons learned and just takeaways from this particular experience in Salem. Again, this is what we learned in Massachusetts, but I think one of the key things is it's important to form coalitions and to really hear what the community wants from a variety of perspectives. Here, SAFE didn't want past, mistakes to be made, and they wanted the coalition to be representative of what the community at large wanted, and I think that takes a lot of work. Sometimes that means, going door to door and, maybe handing out flyers, either creating, public groups to see, like, at the end of the day, what are our top priorities. I think it's going to happen differently in every area, but at least in a community that, could be tight-knit, I think meeting in person and kind of hashing these things out to say, like, what are our top priorities is really, really important. And SAFE had kind of done that pre-work as we started to get involved. The next thing, as I mentioned before, is to know the benefits and even the burdens of a project. What are the good that's coming from this development? But also, what don't we like? Is it a matter, will there be more traffic in one area from the construction process? How do we limit that traffic? So I think those are things that you can mention in a CBA. The other thing is that as projects get permitted, you will also have a planning board and zoning meetings and other requirements. So I will say, with the caveat of the burdens of like certain things will get figured out in the planning board meeting. So if it would be duplicative for it to be in the CBA. So I think in the CBA, you kind of want to maximize on things that won't necessarily get brought up in a planning board meeting. But all of those things, the good and the bad with the project, I think are important in order to get the most from the developer. I say engage with the community from the start because, as I stated before, here in Salem, the mayor and the developer had communicated first before the community, and it took a lot of work in order to get the community at the table, but it was because of their persistence that they did ultimately get their voices heard. And the other thing that I say is that it is really important, I think, for communities to be signatories to the legal agreements. So that means that at the end of the day, once the contract is written out, I think you want the coalition to have their name on it. That did not happen in Salem, and that's something that we speak about, and that is something that I think we all could have wanted. But I think the fact that they're on the oversight committee, that they're reviewing the implementation process of it, is still a benefit. But really what makes a community benefit a CBA is including the community. So if you don't have those voices there, I think, it can be a loss. City, let's say representatives or other representatives may say, hey, but our voices are indicative of a community, we're elected leaders. But I think at the end of the day, there's so much diversity in a community, so to push for how you can be included is really, really important. And having the city official also as a signatory could be helpful because, if there are issues with, let's say, enforcing it later down, if you want to bring up something to court later on, then you have, potential city legal representation there as well. So there's benefits and burdens, and I think, pros and cons, and I think you have to see what works for your community at the end of the day. The next, advocate for specific enforceable provisions, is what I stated before, being clear about what you want in a CBA. As I said, the group here got $9 million from Crowley. They were very pleased with that amount. They knew, the certain areas of where that money, was going. And I think having that recognition before you meet with the developer, because they have a team of big lawyers. They're not, let's say, NGO lawyers or state lawyers. They have their billables, and their attorneys are going to want to bill their clients. So to see, where can we get the most I think is really important. And then leveraging state and federal policy is another thing. So in Massachusetts, we didn't have that advantage of any like CBA guidance documents. Federally, we have some guidance documents from the Department of Energy, which was on my slides before, which just say that CBA should be inclusive, so it should include a variety of voices. It should engage with coalitions. It should be transparent, so you should know what's going on in the negotiations, and it should be enforceable. So all of those things are important considerations. And I think that's it. I think those are my final slides. So yeah, again, this was just some lessons learned from Massachusetts. I hope you can all take some of these lessons and bring it to your community. But I'm happy to take any questions, and thank you again.
Thanks so much, Anxhela. Gosh, I'm like really tall. So I'd love to open up the floor for questions for Anxhela, and just to give folks a sense of time, we'll probably spend about 10 minutes on questions. We'll have another 10 minutes for a different breakout question, and then we'll come back for a quick wrap up of like potential next steps, what our groups that put on this event are happy to offer if that is of interest, and of course cookies, because I love dessert. So who has some questions? Yeah.
Hi, my name is Kevin. I live in Stockton Springs. I'm not actually a Searsport resident, but I'm working on an old house that sits on Stockton Harbor and looks right at Sears Island. So this is a very important issue for me. And I know this is not a question about siting, but I think it's important to note that what the community will want out of the developer is going to depend fundamentally on which site gets picked. And if that design, which is redeveloping an old industrial site. If Sears Island gets picked, the community, rightfully so, will need I don't know, much greater compensation in other ways. It's hard to even fathom Sears Island being actually developed in the way they're discussing. But can you speak to any cases where the CBA process has actually changed the project design, or you essentially through the CBA process offered a developer maybe two different paths? Say, yep, we can make it easier this way, or we can make it a little bit more costly this way.
So I'm just going to restate the question for folks who might watch this later. The question is there any CBA example where the community has actually offered a developer sort of two different paths, or that the CBA might include actual shifts to the project design or requests in that regard? And I'm going to give this to both of you, just knowing that Suzanne might, because I don't think that was part of Salem's, and that's Anxhela's area of expertise, but.
Yeah, I think, let's see if this is on. I will project. But yeah, no, thank you for your question. I'm not an advocate. I'm not an advocate in Maine, so I can't speak towards specific, let's say, nuances of the case here. And in Salem, we did not run across that issue. My involvement with CBAs is pretty specific to the location in Salem. Here, the community, knew that the port was going to be developed in that particular spot because it was open, because of the certain, let's say, geography of the area, and because the plant was closing. So that issue was not common there. But yeah, I will say, I think, Suzanne, you will have knowledge beyond my experience in Salem. So sorry, I can't offer anything more towards that. Yeah.
I'm like, I've got a couple of examples, but there's probably more, so I could get back to you and also ask my colleague Matilda, the one that's reviewed all of the agreements. But the ones that come to mind for me, I think it's a newer one. It was on the slide that I had around the tribal benefit agreements that in California, there's one of the tribes there, the Santa Ynez Band of Chumash Indians in California. My understanding is that they have a tribal benefit agreement, and that they are making commitments around collaborative project planning, including the tribe renaming the project. I don't think that that's like moving the sites, but I think it's definitely more collaborative in spirit. So we could dig into what those details really are. And then I sort of said I've been tracking this for a really long time. One of my first communities that I ever spoke to about this topic was the folks on Martha's Vineyard. And so it's, I'm not sure that it directly translates here, but it's another example of a community. Cape Wind happened, a couple decades ago, went away, and then I think there was a recognition from a group of people on the vineyard that it was going to happen in Massachusetts, and likely proximate to Martha's Vineyard. And so they basically started a process, and this was 15 plus years ago, where they said, if it's going to come, on what terms, where, how would it look? And so they actually started to run this process where they did meetings like this for a long time and basically talked to fishermen. And, in the end, it's still a controversial outcome, the Vineyard Wind project. But what's very interesting, I believe this is correct, is that when the sort of wind energy area and leasing process started with BOEM years and years ago, the folks it's called Vineyard Power, basically said the community is looking at this site. This is the part, of the ocean that we would find least impactful. It has an impact, but less impactful. If you want to develop it in this area, come talk to us. They ended up getting credits through the BOEM process, so Vineyard Wind was successful in part because of that. Then they entered into the first community benefits agreement. And a lot of that had to do with the community actually getting to shape what happened. So I don't think either of those examples get to site selection quite to the degree that you're talking about, but I think there's definitely examples of communities being able to have influence on some pretty big design questions.
Yeah, quick follow-up. Okay.
I'm happy to talk after.
Yeah, we can happy to stay after and answer anything and write down any questions, but.
Yes, so my question is about enforcement in the sense that you brought up the importance of taking consideration of the project and getting some of these agreements rolling earlier in the process, but so much enforcement or rather like lawsuit
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I can answer it in a few ways. I think first, it's a fair assessment to say that, let's say, judicial review, so courts assessing community benefits agreements, it's still pretty low, let's say. So there haven't really been a lot of instances where a court is, let's say, like assessing, does this provision apply? Does this fall in line with, let's say, the state's laws? But I think that's because of the first part that I said, is that there's an incentive for the developer to follow through with the CBA as well, because they want to engage, they don't want these drawn out legal battles as well. They don't want, let's say, a new, if it's a city official or a state leader, to go into power and then to reverse their development process and then change the permitting process as well, because they want the development to go through all of the requirements and permits that they have to go through as well. So I think there's several ways that you can engage in the CBA to let's say, make it enforceable, or let's say to have it be executed correctly. And I think that's kind of the benefit of what I was saying, the CBA in Salem is public, because you could literally take some of those provisions, copy and paste it into what you would want in your neighborhood. And I think the community oversight review, so ensuring that you're meeting either monthly or quarterly with the developer and saying, here's what went right, it just makes sure that they're kind of keeping in line with what they promised. And I think there's a few other, and I think you were going to share some resources. So I think doing a comparative review of like, what are the other ways that other CBAs have kind of done oversight. Sometimes you can even have the money go into a trust, let's say, right away. And then, let's say, the city leader could kind of release or disperse that money on a certain basis. So I think this is where a community can get really creative with the process. Like it's not something that needs to be legal or technical or like anything that way. I think it's a matter of like, how do we bring power back to ourselves? And that's the benefit of a community benefits agreement, is it brings power back to the community and away from the developer, and they have an incentive to do so. And I think with creativity and kind of conversations in a community like this, that's where you can really start to get into the nuances of those things, regardless of, the site at the end of the day. So.
Thanks, Anxhela. One thing I'd add on that just knowing that, I'm not sure sort of like which pieces of the legal process you're talking about, but one of the things that I've heard repeatedly, and just in all of sort of the work that I've done researching CBAs and broader like community partnership planning, just the many different ways and avenues, as Suzanne was talking about, there's like different kinds and different parts of the process that benefits can come, is just hearing repeatedly, like there's so many differences, and it really can, like we're just talking about that legal mechanism that can contain, whatever in essence the community wants to get from a developer and has the leverage to get. But across all of them, the advice that we've heard is just like start thinking early. And so I think one thing to keep in mind is that multiple processes can be happening at the same time. We'll talk about this after we come back, but like the negotiation step is so far down the line that a lot of the sort of earlier pre-work could be happening at the same time that some of the other conversations around siting and things like that are happening, even before any agreement is signed. I think one more question and then we'll head to a breakout group. Yes.
Yeah, it seemed critical in Salem for you to get involved, for the Conservation Law Foundation to enable that group to get a seat at the table. And I'm wondering, first of all, were they paid? Did you get paid? And secondly, is there a recommendation for how to do that if we can't? Here there's different groups. There's groups that want to protect the island. There's groups that are just pushing for the port no matter what. There's people that don't want anything. And I'm concerned about that, like how to actually get at the table.
Yeah, that's a great question. And so CLF being a public interest organization, no, we don't get direct payments from SAFE or SOA. I joined the coalition as part of my workload and had to handle that with all my other cases going on. So for us, nothing goes up or down. It's just, we don't take them on as like a billable client. Public interest law, it doesn't work that way. So I think there are certain things, yes, there are firms that actually will do it pro bono. So we actually did speak to a firm that was open to getting involved because attorneys have requirements to engage with communities or incentives to do so. So there are firms that will do it as well. So they'll take on the cases and they'll get involved. But I think it depends on, are there attorneys in your direct neighborhood? Would it be an outside legal group? There's a lot of questions that, if specifics like that come down the line, I'd be happy to speak to you about that. But it is true. I think, I don't know if CLF didn't get involved. If it would have, it might have. I think the other thing that I didn't mention is that SAFE did get the mayor elected. They were pretty supportive of him, and so I think they were kind of grappling with this balance of, we're supportive of this elected leader, but we kind of feel excluded. So how do we manage this? And I think at first that's why we didn't really come on as legal representation in the beginning. We just came on as just sort of this advisory role. But I think once we did do that, I think he got the signal of like, oh, they really are serious about this, and that did maybe shift it. Who's to say? But I think getting legal representation, which can happen on a pro bono basis, it can be helpful in moving these processes along.
Can I also just interject here, because I know in some of the work we're doing learning about these things, we have heard often that having professional facilitators can be really helpful for communities. And I don't have the answer on who pays for them or how that happens, but there are people out there who know how to do this and know how to help a community get all of its facets together and go through the steps that I think Lucy will be talking about to find their voice, to make that list, and also legal representation is highly recommended to go into negotiations because of what you said, that they come with their team of lawyers as developers. So that this is something that if your community, if you all start to meet and think about it, we could provide resources to where we've heard that from and what kind of people, and find out how they get paid. Because that can be helpful, given that, you're saying, I'm not from Searsport. Is it just Searsport, or is it everyone who's on the harbor or the bay, right, or in this region? And what is the community, defining the community, which I think leads
that leads us to our next breakout question. So again, this is not that we're going to answer anything today. I know folks want to get home and go to bed, so we're just going to spend 10 minutes on it. But I think one of the other questions that, if this is something you would want to move forward with, is an early question you want to ask is, who will be impacted by any development? Who's here tonight? Who's missing? So who are the voices? What is our definition of a community? How broad are we looking? And who might be here and who might not? And let's split into slightly separate groups. So awesome. That seemed like such a great discussion. I heard so much happening. Yeah, if you have a Post-it note and want to put it up on the board, feel free to take it over there. I see lots of frantic writing. It's like the end of a standardized test. Awesome. Well, thank you so much. And I just wanted to really thank everyone for coming tonight, for following our community agreements, for being so engaged. I heard so much fantastic conversation. We had really great questions. And I just wanted to leave off with a what's next. After this presentation, what can you do? What are the possible avenues and paths forward? So this was really intended to be an initial presentation. What possible opportunities are there for community partnerships when there's a development, specifically with offshore wind, but also knowing that this recording might go elsewhere in the state with other kinds of development, and really specifically that community benefits agreement mechanism. Totally up to everyone in this room whether that's something you want to pursue with your community and who you see your community as, knowing that sometimes it can be a really small neighborhood, it can be a whole region. And so if this is something that you do want to pursue, I just wanted to turn folks' attention toward a really great framework that I found, knowing that all CBAs have different ways that they end up into being, as we heard from Suzanne. This is a constantly growing field, but here's some like recommended best practices if you want to look toward doing something like this. And the first step is really around building the coalition. And the more research I did, the more I learned that this sometimes happens before there's even a project on the table. So in some small towns, they just start building these kinds of coalitions in the event that someone might want to develop someday. And then the next step is issue education. So what kinds of issues are we going to run into with a CBA? What is a CBA? How do we talk to people about this? Do we need to educate the press? Do we need to educate our neighbors? Do we need to educate specific organizations or constituencies, elected officials? That's that issue education step. 3, the reason we're in Searsport tonight is that a project has already been identified. There is this possibility of an offshore wind port in Searsport that could have a CBA. Doesn't need to, it's totally up to the community here and where the project goes. But in the event that a community was organizing before there's even a project, there would be that identification of a project step. And then the next step is research. So that's potentially one of the things that would be coming up next. And that's really where you find what the different points of involvement are, where you might be able to get involved in the process. So it sounds like hearing from Anxhela, that is potentially where like CLF got in with SAFE and SOA, was to help with that research of like, where are the entry points that we as a community can get involved? Where might we have some leverage? Where might there be an opening? What does the timeline look like? What are the official processes? Then that's moving into a community assessment. That's sort of the first breakout question we had, but in a much more systematic way to make sure that everyone is included, really assessing what the community's needs are. And after that, having a real time to identify, we have all of these needs, what are our priorities? Like if we only get some things, how do we decide what's at the top? Step number 7 is that applying leverage piece. So what we heard from Anxhela of often communities will be able to go to a developer and say, and have leverage about their support for the project. That's often where that leverage is coming from, of whether this community group or coalition will support and be publicly in support of a project. But there might be other points of leverage. So sort of identifying where those are for your coalition that you've built. Step 8, form a negotiating team. It's really hard for a developer to talk to 30 different people and know who it is they're supposed to be talking to. And the negotiating team is really, that's where you might want to bring in a lawyer. It's where you want to be really clear about who speaks for the coalition and who doesn't. And really making sure that no one gets cut out from that process. Like if there's a community coalition, they're speaking to the community coalition and not just the mayor, and making that really, really clear. Then you'll have that actual negotiation step that's really far down the line. There's a lot of pre-work that happens, and then the eventual signing of an agreement if that is, the negotiations go well and that's what the community group wants. And so this is just a framework. There's so much more on the internet. There's a lot of resources that our organizations have been compiling, and a lot of folks working on this around the country. So just wanted to leave an open offer for anyone who wants to start talking amongst yourselves about, hey, we might want to have a meeting about this, or we want to invite someone. There are cookies on the table. I love dessert. Please stay and have cookies and have those discussions. And also know that if there is ever a point where you've gotten together and you do think that this is something you want to do and you need more help with research, or you want connections to other places that have done this, or you want to know, is there the possibility of getting a pro bono lawyer? I don't know where to begin. The organizations that put this event on, Maine Conservation Voters, Maine Labor Climate Council, Maine Climate Action Now, we are not here to be part of any community benefits agreement, but we are here to offer any resources and help. I'm happy if anyone wants to come up to me after, give you my number, give you my email. Please feel free to reach out anytime to any of us, and we're happy to answer questions and be as engaged as you'd like us to be. But thanks so much for coming. Yes, we'll share lots of things to people who put their emails. So we'll share answers to questions. If you have those, give them to us and we'll respond individually there. We'll share the presentations to folks who gave their email at the beginning. And we also will have this great recording, which I don't really know the timeline on, to be honest, but we maybe can share what the timeline looks like for getting that and sharing that out. But really appreciate folks coming. And again, if you want more support, further information, like I have a whole Google Drive because I'm a nerd of just like all the information I've ever read about community benefits agreements. Just come up to me, get my phone number, email, happy to send that over. So thanks so much.